Hello, and welcome back to the Mountebank History of Scotland series podcasts. My name is Daniel Downey. I am a professional comedian based in Edinburgh. I'm also a historian of Scottish history. I got a master's degree in Scottish history, and today's episode is all about the return of the king. But don't despair. It's not going to be like 3.5 hours long, although I can't promise that it won't be as boring as the Lord of the Rings films are. It's about the return to the throne of King Charles II in 1660. After the death of Oliver Cromwell in September 1658, his son Richard took over as the modestly titled Lord Protector of the Commonwealth of England. But this second incarnation of Cromwell, it turned out to be a musical with Lady Gaga in that. And the people, they did not like it one bit. And so the decision was taken to restore the monarchy that Oliver Cromwell had worked so hard to depose. And so in 1660, it paved the way for King Charles II to return to the thrones of England, Scotland and Ireland. Now, this was a political comeback that at one point seemed as unlikely as Nige Farage returning to head up the Reform Party, although, of course, that's less a return of the king and more a return of the cunt. Charles's reign, it's often associated with a return to the good times after the oppressive reign of the religious Puritans under Oliver Cromwell. Charles, he's remembered as the merry monarch or the jolly monarch. And that's not because he was a particularly nice guy, or it's not because he was particularly jovial over the Christmas period or anything like that. You know, although to be fair to Charles II, he certainly did enjoy a good ho. And he was particularly adept at emptying his sack as well, because Charles II, he fathered 14 illegitimate children. That places him just behind Genghis Khan and Boris Johnson in terms of men who have spread their seed the furthest. If you're watching this in America, by the way, that joke works just as well with Elon Musk. They're interchangeable cunts. Now, when it came to Scotland, Charles, he was enthusiastically welcomed back to the throne of Scotland. But Charles, he had not forgotten about the shabby treatment he had received in Scotland by the Scots Presbyterian Commissioners, who would constantly berate him about the evils of his family and how terrible his father and his brother and his grandfather were. They'd quote all sorts of other quotes from Prince Harry's autobiography as well. And so Charles, when he returned to Scotland, he did so with a chip in his shoulder, and his return would result in a lot of persecutions of Scots Presbyterians. And so Charles's reign, it may have meant that, yeah, you could go back out and have a pint again, but it was also connected with a lot of deaths in Scotland. It was kind of like the eat out to help out of the 17th century. Now, if this is the first time that you're watching the series, or if you've never listened to my podcast before, this is the sort of thing that you should expect, all right? It's Scottish history with lots of jokes about the royal family and lots of Tory bashing. If that sounds like your thing, you're going to enjoy it. If not, I don't know, maybe try one of the other Dans, Dan Snow or Dan Carlin, something like that, I don't know. But anyway, I hope you enjoy this week's episode. It's all about the return to power of King Charles II. Have fun out there, and I'll see you all on the other side. Enjoy! In 1660, Charles was in the Netherlands at the court of his sister Mary, the Princess of Orange, and her husband William II, the Prince of Orange. And after weeks of meetings with English commissioners in the Netherlands, on the 4th of April 1660, King Charles II, he signed the Declaration of Breda. Now, the declaration, it granted permission for an English convention to administer the English Parliament before Charles's return to claim the throne. The Declaration of Breda, it was an important document that would set out the condition of Charles's return to the English throne after his famous escape to Europe in the wake of his defeat at the Battle of Worcester in September 1651. The Declaration agreed to recommission the army to the services of the Crown in return for Charles agreeing to pardon crimes that had been committed against royalists during the Civil War and the interregnum. Now, the extent to which Charles actually stuck to his promise to not seek out revenge is debatable, but immunity from prosecution was of particular importance to the man who was driving these negotiations, General George Monk. Monk, he had served as the military governor of Scotland during the Cromwellian occupation of the country, and he was one of Cromwell's most trusted generals and allies. But Monk had, at the start of the Civil Wars, actually fought on the royalist side. He only changed to the parliamentarian side after his capture at the Battle of Nantwich in 1644. And so it was important that he got immunity from Charles. Now, Charles, he granted Monk immunity from prosecution and he made him Duke of Albemarle and Captain General of the Army. But Monk, he had been ready to make a complete political U-turn in order to save his own skin. These days, he'd 100% have a right-wing podcast. On the 25th of May, 1660, Charles set sail from Holland and he arrived at Dover where he was greeted by Monk, who presented him with his sword. This was a symbolic gesture indicating that the army was now loyal to Charles. Symbolic gestures such as these are important to high-profile leaders. The symbolic relevance of fucking a dead pig in the mouth, you'd have to ask David Cameron about that one. I don't know. But on the 29th of May, 1660, Charles's 30th birthday, he was proclaimed king in London to huge fanfare. And Charles, he commented with the wry humour that he was known for, "It must surely have been our own fault that we have been so long absent from a country where everyone seems so glad to see me." Charles, he seems to have been quite aware that his return was less, in inverted commas, triumph, and more a case of, well, we couldn't really think of anyone better, so we just decided to go back to doing what we were doing before. His return is kind of like Brendan Rodgers going back to Celtic. 6 days after Charles was proclaimed king in London, he was proclaimed king in Edinburgh, again to great fanfare. The cannons of Edinburgh Castle were fired and there was claret running out of the city's fountains, which is mad to think that there was a time when wine would run freely in the fountains of Edinburgh. Now you can't even have a can of dark fruits in the park. Now, Charles, he had little interest in testing his newfound popularity in Scotland. This is despite the fact that he was already the King of Scotland. The Scots had, of course, coronated Charles King of Scotland on New Year's Day in 1651. When he returned, he was already the King of Scotland. And the Scots had fought and died in the name of King Charles II at the Battle of Dunbar in 1650 and the Battle of Worcester in 1651. But Charles, he had developed a deep, deep dislike of Scottish Presbyterians, which is ironic because they would 100% have put a photograph of him up in their changing rooms. When it came to Scotland, it's safe to say that Charles, he had scores to settle and a determination to never set foot in his northern kingdom ever again. As someone who was determined to never leave London and had a deep, deep dislike of all things Scottish, Charles II, he would have made the perfect leader of the Scottish Labour Party. On his march south in early 1660, Monk, he carried with him petitions from Scotland asking King Charles II that he maintain the political union between England and Scotland on more favourable terms for Scotland. You couldn't have got much less favourable terms in 1660, considering the country was still under military occupation. Scotland was being occupied militarily by England. But this was a kind of sizable moment because amongst these Cromwellian yes men who wanted to maintain this union came the first stirrings of genuine unionism in Scotland. At the beginning of the 17th century, King James VI of Scotland and James I of England, he had envisaged an inverted commas perfect union. That is, a single British nation state with one head of state and one parliament. Now, Oliver Cromwell, ironically, was the person who was able to create this perfect union that James had envisaged. At the time of James's rule, no one either side of the border in England or Scotland really wanted this to happen. James was the only one that was pushing it. Now, Cromwell had created the union that James couldn't, but it wasn't a political union, it was a military occupation. But there were petitions that were sent down with Monk from Scotland asking that this union be maintained. So this is where we get some of the first stirrings of unionism in Scotland. Now, as it happened, Scotland was always going to return to its independent state now that Charles II was coming back. And Scotland's national independence came very quietly in the end and with very little fanfare. There was no royal proclamation or even a formal dissolution of the Cromwellian incorporation. Scotland was just quietly reinstated with no one mentioning what had happened previously. It was like letting Prince Andrew back into the royal family. The Committee of Estates that was captured by Monk at Perth in September 1651, it was simply reinstated until such a time that Charles could decide on his Scottish ministers and that a Scottish Parliament could be called. One of the most important men Charles II would look to assist with his rule in Scotland was James Sharp. James Sharp, he was a moderate Presbyterian resolutioner minister with a parish in Crail and Fife, and he had been one of the members of the Committee of Estates that was captured by Monk in Perth in 1651. He was imprisoned in the Tower of London, but was released after only a few months, and he became an intermediary between the Kirk and the Cromwellian representatives in Scotland throughout the Cromwellian Incorporation of Scotland. This was a job that was more miserable than being the Tottenham manager. Sharp, he was a skilled negotiator, and as a defeated enemy, he worked hard to protect the Presbyterian Kirk in Scotland during the Cromwellian interregnum. And with Charles II's restoration, Sharp, he continued to do everything in his power to protect the Kirk from the wrath of King Charles II and his infamous hatred of Presbyterian Scotland. Sharp, he was trying to convince Charles that the Presbyterians weren't all that bad. He's like an agent trying to convince a player to sign for Rangers, or, Rangers trying to convince a billionaire American owner to actually invest in them. This is at least how Sharp may try and present his CV. And James Sharp is argued by many modern historians to be one of Scotland's most adept and talented politicians. But for many others, particularly the Presbyterian protesters, Sharp is the quintessential bogeyman. For them, Sharp was a career man who turned his back on the Presbyterian Kirk, abandoned his Presbyterian religion, and betrayed the church for his own personal advantage. And it's a charge that's difficult for Sharp to shake. Sharp, he would play a key role in the national church settlement of 1662, which would see Presbyterians removed from positions of public office and the controversial reintroduction of bishops to Scotland and return to its pre-1638 episcopal church structure. For Presbyterians, Sharp was someone who disregarded his own personal beliefs to advance his political career. He was like Boris Johnson pretending that he actually thinks Brexit's a good idea. Sharp was made one of 4 Scottish bishops by Charles II before then being consecrated as Scotland's prelate, the Archbishop of St Andrews, which was the most high-profile church position in Restoration Scotland. Sharp's acceptance of this highly controversial position, along with his childhood spent in the Episcopal Northeast and his education at the Episcopal Anti-Covenant University of Aberdeen, meant that accusations of treachery against the Presbyterian Church, they weren't easy for him to rid himself of. As a Presbyterian minister, it would appear that Sharp, he was always pretending to be something he wasn't. It's like when that Brewdog guy keeps going on about being a fisherman or just, attempts to act like a fucking human being. Sharp's apparent treachery, it would end up costing him his life at the hands of the Covenanters after he was brutally murdered by Covenanting assailants in May 1679. But this is something that we're going to cover in future episodes down the line. Charles II's rule is often associated with moral laxity after the stern rule of the Puritans. His court hosted notoriously raucous parties. None of them were during a plague outbreak, mind you. Theatres, they were reopened after being closed by the Puritans. And for the first time in British history, women were permitted to act on the stage. Charles, he reintroduced public holidays and he allowed feasts, festivals and celebrations that had been banned by the Puritans, such as Christmas Day. Charles, he was also a notorious womanizer stroke pussy grabber. He had already fathered 4 children before his return to England, where he's said to have fathered at least 14 illegitimate children, but was unable to produce a legitimate heir with his wife, Catherine of Braganza. Catherine, she was a devout Catholic, and this riled the religious Puritans. They didn't want the king to be married to a Catholic. They felt the king should be married to a good, traditional, English, ugly wife. Now, it might seem mental to us in the 21st century that anyone would have an issue with someone marrying someone because of their religion. Do you know what I mean? Especially someone in the royal family. Thank God we live in a much more enlightened time whereby members of the royal family, they can marry whoever they want. No one, for example, would have an issue with someone in the royal family in the 21st century marrying somebody of mixed race. That just wouldn't be an issue at all. Now, Catherine, she was the Infantana of Portugal, the daughter of King John IV, who had successfully ended the 60-year rule of the Spanish Habsburgs in Portugal. But Catherine, she was left isolated while Charles went out and shagged everything that moved. She was like Conor McGregor's wife in that respect. And Catherine's devout Catholicism, it would wear Protestant alliances thin. as would Charles's own suspected Catholicism. In 1670, Charles was alleged to have signed a secret agreement with Louis XIV of France, committing to Catholic conversion in return for French support against the Dutch. Now, the extent to which this was actually the case is debated by historians, but Charles did eventually convert to Catholicism on his deathbed in 1685. It's mad how these excessively hairy sexual predators, they love converting to Catholicism on their deaths. Like Charles II on his deathbed and Russell Brand on the death of his career. Charles, he was known as the Merry Monarch or the Jolly Monarch because of the relative freedom that people were able to enjoy after the stern morality of the Cromwellian era. And Charles's reign, it probably was a breath of fresh air after the Cromwellian era. He was, by 17th century standards, a modern and progressive monarch, or at least as modern and progressive as someone can be who believes that they've been appointed by God to rule their kingdom. Charles, he had no time for stuffy court rituals. He was a keen sailor, and he would regularly take strolls in St James's Park in London and frequent the local taverns and attend plays. He was an intelligent man with an interest in philosophy and science. When it came to Scotland, Charles was knowledgeable of his northern kingdom after the time that he had spent there, although whether this was a positive or not from a Scottish perspective is debatable, because nobody understood the moral density of Presbyterianism more than Charles did, who was constantly berated and lectured by the Presbyterian Commissioners during his time in Scotland. And, as we've already mentioned, it left him with a deep disdain of Scottish Presbyterianism. But for many, Charles, he was an embarrassment as a king. He had no interest in formal paperwork. He was lazy, and he would pass formal work onto his ministers to deal with while he enjoyed the leisures of his court. He spent heavily and played hard and fast with his European alliances, and of course, he was constantly shagging. Charles, he had lots of spunk and charisma and confidence without the necessary talent to back it up. He was like Robbie Williams. It's safe to say that Charles II divided and continues to divide opinion. The monarchy, it was back in Britain, but many of the resentments that were harboured during that Civil War era, they continued to boil over into the Restoration period. The restoration of the monarchy meant not just the restoration of the king, but the restoration of the nobility as well. The rich people who had been frozen out by the previous administration, they were now in charge and wielding chainsaws about the place. During the interregnum, the Scottish nobility, they had either been imprisoned in England, they were living in exile in Europe, or had been reduced to insignificance through excessive and constant fines and confiscations. I've mentioned all this in the previous episode. But now that nobility was restored, there was a rush amongst them to claim positions of power and privilege. The Earl of Glencairn, who had backed the unsuccessful Royalist Revolution in the Highlands in 1654, he was appointed Chancellor. John Middleton, the Earl of Middleton, another leader of the Glencairn Rebellion, he was made Charles's Commissioner to the Scottish Parliament, and the hard-drinking, rather uncouth but highly educated Earl of Lauderdale, who had spent 10 years in prison after his capture at the Battle of Worcester in 1651, he was made Scotland's Secretary of State. The noble families, they had hoped that the restoration would coincide with the reimbursement of everything that they had lost during the interregnum. However, the crown, it didn't have all that much money, and there were few positions of power to be divvied out. The nobility, they had been excluded from power for 12 years, during which time Scotland had been ruled with hardly any influence from the nobility. Hardly any of the great noble families had anything like the influence that they used to have in Scotland. Now, the posh folk, they had waited and waited for their return to Scotland. They were like middle-class families waiting to visit Edinburgh in August during the Fringe. But now that they were back, even with the government at its weakest, it was still able to exercise influence on the nobility, influence that Charles I and his predecessors would have found completely and utterly unacceptable. Even with the restoration, power had to be exercised with far greater parliamentary influence and central government in Scotland. Before the business of government could begin, Charles, he had some personal scores that he wanted to settle, and this would not bode well for the Scots Presbyterian Commissioners who had berated and lectured Charles so thoroughly during his time in Scotland between 1650 and 1651. Charles, he'd been away basically doing nothing for a decade, and now he was back. He was desperately wanting to take out his frustrations on the Scottish Presbyterians. He was like Kieran Tierney. Number one in Charles's crosshairs was Oliver Cromwell. Charles wasn't going to let the fact that Cromwell was dead stop him from getting his revenge. Charles, he had Cromwell dug up so he could be used as Anthony Joshua's next boxing opponent. Cromwell's body, it was removed from Westminster Abbey. It was tied to a hurdle and dragged through the streets of London. His body was then hung for 24 hours and his head removed and placed on a pike at Tyburn, which was the traditional spot for the punishment of commoners in London. Charles then had Cromwell's body dismembered and flung on a dung heap, which was supposed to be a great insult, but actually was a very modern and eco-friendly way of disposing of a body. I'm sure that Greta would have approved. And of the 60 men who had signed his father's death warrant, only 20 remained alive, and Charles, he had 9 of them tracked down and executed for treason. In Scotland, the most high-profile recipient of Charles's retribution was the kingdom's highest-profile member of the nobility, the man who had placed the crown on Charles II's head at his Scottish coronation at Scone, Archibald Campbell, the Marquess of Argyll. Charles, he went after the guy who'd put the crown on his head. It'd be like if Donald Trump murdered Elon Musk. Argyll was, of course, the arch-nemesis of royalist Scotland and of the swashbuckling cavalier hero James Graham, the Marquess of Montrose. After the execution of Charles I in 1649 and Charles II's subsequent time spent in Scotland, there was a pragmatic thawing of relations between Charles and Argyll. Charles had, in fact, promised Argyll a dukedom, £40,000 in cash, and at one point, Argyll's daughter was the front-runner to marry the Scots king. However, after Charles II's hopes in Scotland were dashed by the defeat of the Scots army at Worcester in September 1651, Argyll, he submitted to the Cromwellian regime and he retired to his estates in Inverary. His power lost, Argyll, he was deeply in debt and on poor terms with his own heir, who was a royalist. Although he would then turn back to being a Covenanter and become a Covenanting martyr like his father. It's mad how like often these royalist laddies like change and go back and forth. You know, they do more coming and going than Bonnie Blue. At the restoration of Charles II, Argyll travelled to London to make peace with the king, to try and connect with him. But Charles, he gave Argyll the cold shoulder. He had him locked up in the Tower of London and he was returned to Scotland along with other enemies of the king, where he was imprisoned on New Year's Day 1661 in Edinburgh Castle, which is a little ironic because it was Edinburgh Castle where Argyll had imprisoned Montrose during the visit of Charles I to Scotland in 1641. Argyll, he was put on trial in front of the Parliament in Edinburgh on charges of treason. Now, as a high-profile member of the nobility, Argyll's chances of acquittal, despite Charles's obvious dislike of him, they were actually pretty good. However, when General George Monk produced papers to the Parliament that implied Argyll pledged support for Cromwell, and not only did he pledge support for Cromwell, but actually played an active role in putting down the Glencairn Rebellion of 1652, well, Argyll's fate was sealed. Monk, he was definitely deflecting onto Argyll here to detract from his own treachery. It's like what Harry Maguire's teammates do. If everyone just concentrates on how bad this guy is, no one's going to notice how shite the rest of us are. Argyll, he was charged and found guilty of treason, not for his actions during the civil wars, but for his supposed collaboration with the Cromwellian regime. He was executed in Edinburgh on the 27th of May 1661 by means of the Maiden, which was a kind of early version of the guillotine that was used for executions in Scotland between the 16th and 18th centuries. After his execution, Argyll's head was swapped purposely with that of Montrose's on top of the Tolbooth prison in Edinburgh. And it's hard to picture a more powerful representation of the turnaround in fortunes between the Covenanters and Royalists at the conclusion of the War of the Three Kingdoms than these two great rivals' heads literally being swapped on top of the Tolbooth prison. Argyll, his body was buried in the Culman Mausoleum, the traditional burial spot of the Dukes of Argyll in Inverary, and his head was also deposited there in 1664 after its very public display on top of the Tolbooth prison. An ornate marble effigy to Argyll was erected in St Giles Cathedral in Edinburgh in 1859, and it's identical in almost every way to his great rival Montrose, whose effigy lies across the aisle from his. It really is quite something. These two great rivals, their effigies are across the aisle from each other for all eternity. I think it's amazing. It'd be like if you were to have Rebecca Vardy and Colleen Rooney's effigies across the aisle from each other. Argyll, on his effigy, he has a quote that he gave from a speech at his execution. It states, "I set the crown upon the king's head, and now he hastens me to a better crown than his own." He'd be as well just have "fuck you, Charles" on there, which was apparently the final words of the Queen. Argyll's powerful words, they donate his commitment to the Covenant right up until his unfortunate, if not quite fitting, end. Because Argyll, he suffered the same fate as his great rival Montrose. Both were executed while at the wrong end of the great power struggle between Covenanter and Royalists, which had played out in Scotland over the past 25 years. Although it should be pointed out that Argyll's decapitation was a far less traumatic end than Montrose's kind of drawn out, torturous hanging. I suppose if you spend the best part of your career constantly bad-mouthing someone, then you can't really be too surprised when that person takes their opportunity to exact their revenge. It's why Graham Souness has to constantly check over his shoulder for Paul Pogba. 5 days after Argyll's execution, the ultra-Presbyterian minister of Stirling, Reverend James Guthrie, he pled guilty quite happily, I should hasten to add, to high treason. Guthrie, he absolutely despised Charles, and he had preached vehemently against the king during his time in Scotland, reminding him, even on his return at the Restoration, that as a covenanted king, Charles had a responsibility to carry out the covenants, and that God would punish him if he did not introduce Presbyterianism across the three kingdoms. The hardline Presbyterians, they were still clinging to the idea of universal Presbyterianism in Britain right up until their deaths. Guthrie, he was made an example of. He was hanged on the 1st of June, 1661, defiantly shouting from the scaffold like a member of Fathers for Justice. He proclaimed before his public execution, "The covenants shall be Scotland's reviving." Another who Charles had targeted for his vengeance was Neil MacLeod of Asson. This was the man who had given up Montrose to the authorities at Ardvec after Montrose's escape from the Battle of Carbisdale in 1650. MacLeod, he was locked in Edinburgh's Tolbooth prison, where he was able to turn the prison into a place of late-night revelry, and where members of Edinburgh's high society would come down to party every night. He was supposed to be on lockdown, but was partying every night. He was the quintessential Tory during the COVID pandemic. But MacLeod, he never actually faced Charles's retribution. During one night of revelry, he was able to make his escape from the toll booth and able to escape justice after constantly partying more easily than Boris Johnson at the COVID inquiry. One of the last to receive Charles's wrath in Scotland was Archibald Johnson of Warriston. He was a co-author of the National Covenant, and during the Cromwellian incorporation of Scotland, he had become a commissioner, a member of the Council of State. And so, as a kind of staunch Covenanter and a Cromwellian collaborator, Johnson, he was a prime target to receive Charles II's wrath. Johnson, he escaped to France and he was tried for treason and sentenced to death in absentia. In June 1663, the French agreed to extradite Johnson back to Scotland, and he was hanged in Edinburgh on the 23rd of July, 1663. Charles, he had now got his hands and got his retribution against most of the leading Covenanters and Cromwellian collaborators in Scotland, at least those that he could conceivably get his hands on. And so now he had to focus on how exactly he intended on administering and governing his northern kingdom. On New Year's Day 1661, the first restored Scottish Parliament was summoned by King Charles II. The Earl of Middleton, as Charles's commissioner to the Scottish Parliament, was sent north to open the Parliament. And on New Year's Day, he rode with the committee estates and the regalia on display in full pomp and ceremony up Edinburgh's Royal Mile to open the Parliament. And he was completely pished the entire time. A posh guy pontificating while drunk and in costume on Edinburgh's Royal Mile. If you would like to see this sort of thing for yourself in the city, just come and visit us in August, folks. One of the first points of order for the restored Parliament was the reinterment of the dismembered body of the Marquess of Montrose, who was then given a lavish state funeral at St Giles Cathedral. Montrose, he was made great again, which was a task that nobody thought possible, to be honest. Montrose, he was given a lavish state funeral because the monarch felt guilty about the circumstances of his death. He was like the 17th century's Princess Diana. The first sizable legislation of the restored Scottish Parliament was the sweeping Residency Act, which annulled every law passed in Scotland since 1633. Every single piece of legislation which had been passed by the previous administration was just torn up, which is presumably what the next administration in America is going to have to do in 4 years' time. Royal prerogatives were restored that gave the king the ability to call and dissolve parliaments and to name councillors and judges. Office bearers, they were made to swear an oath of allegiance to the new regime. And noblemen, they got back their heritable jurisdictions. I talked about this a wee bit on last week's podcast. Basically, what this meant was the noble courts that Cromwell had abolished, they were now restored. The nobles were also restored their rights of noble kirk patronage, which meant that they could choose the parish ministers. And when it came to the national covenants, they were all outlawed. The days of Scotland being run as a Presbyterian theocracy or as a Presbyterian majority, those days were over. The Cromwellian era was over. The rule of saints was over. Scotland's laws, Parliament and courts were to be reinstated as a matter of national patriotism. The dissolution of the Cromwellian Commonwealth and the restoration of Scotland's independent institutions, it would bring up issues of the balance of power between Scotland and England. It would bring up economic rivalries between the two nations and demands on the king's attention. And these issues, they would become more and more pronounced as the 17th century wore on. But most inflammatory of all, because the Residency Act annulled all laws passed in Scotland since 1633, it meant that in Scotland, the church was to return to its pre-1633 structure, i.e., it was going to return to be an Episcopal church and not a Presbyterian church, which at its most basic level meant the reintroduction of bishops to Scotland. Both Lauderdale and Sharp advised Charles against the reintroduction of Episcopalianism in Scotland. They reminded the king that it was Charles I's decision to implement Anglican church rituals and introduce an Anglican prayer book to Scotland that had led to the Bishop Wars of 1639. But there were a lot of Episcopalians in Scotland, especially in the northeast of Scotland around Aberdeen, and a lot of the Highland clans were Episcopalians. So a modified episcopacy, it could work in Scotland. The problem was the outlawing of the national covenant. Yes, there were a lot of royalists in Scotland, but many of those royalists had signed the national covenant, including Montrose, who was the most pronounced and most important of all the royalist heroes and supporters in Scotland. But Charles, he had learned from his father's mistakes in Scotland. The reintroduction of episcopacy in Scotland, it did not come with an Anglican prayer book, and it didn't come with Anglican church rituals or the changing of altars in Scottish churches or anything like that. But ultimately, at the end of the day, for Charles II in the 17th century, monarchy and Presbyterianism were incompatible, in much the same way that Presbyterianism and winning league titles, is incompatible in the 21st century. On the 6th September 1661, the Church of Scotland officially was restored to being an Episcopalian church. And the reintroduction of bishops to Scotland, it was difficult for many to stomach. James Sharp, he was consecrated as the Archbishop of St Andrews, and 4 new bishops were introduced to Scotland, meaning that all that the Kirk had fought for since 1638 was now lost. Scottish people, we just don't like bishops that much. I'm sorry, all right? We don't like a guy who can only move diagonally, all right? We're side-to-side people in this country. It's why we love the slosh so much. And so, with Charles now being able to choose bishops, and those bishops choosing parish ministers, it meant that the king now had huge influence over the church in Scotland. And Scottish people, we do not like that. We believe that religion should stay where it belongs, in Scottish football. An equally as controversial piece of legislation was passed by the Scottish Government in June 1661, and that was the Act of Presentation and Collection, which declared vacant all Scottish parishes whose ministers had been appointed since 1649. All ministers would have to seek the patronage of the local laird and confirmation from the bishop of the local diocese in order to maintain their jobs, basically. The act was designed to root out the most prominent protesting Presbyterians. Nearly 300 ministers, most of them from the southwest of Scotland, but including at least 40 resolutionist Presbyterian ministers. They were removed from their parishes for their non-conformity to the new regime. It was legislation that resulted in 300 people losing their jobs because they refused to conform to the new regime. It was the Doge of the 17th century. In the political furrow that followed in the wake of the Act of Presentation and Collection, Charles, he replaced Middleton as his Scottish Commissioner to the Parliament with John Leslie, the Earl of Rothes. And the ministers who lost their parishes, they were replaced by King's curates. These were essentially royalist yes men who were sent to fill up the vacancies of the displaced ministers. And in most cases, congregations refused to listen to these curates, and instead they followed their displaced ministers into secret new places of worship, normally the fields and hillsides and barns of the Scottish countryside. And these illegal, secret, clandestine congregations became known as conventicles. And as time progressed, they would become an increasing concern for the government in Scotland. And it is these conventicles that we are going to talk about in the next episode of the podcast. So that brings us to the end of this episode. I do hope you enjoyed it and you're enjoying the Mountebank History of Scotland series. I've only got like 3 videos on YouTube so far, but I do have 34 episodes of the podcast. So if you want to check out some of those earlier episodes that are not on YouTube, then go find them on Spotify, Apple, all that sort of stuff. It's on there at the Mountebank History of Scotland. Give it a like. Give it a comment and share and help me get my subscribers up here on YouTube as well, and just try and build it if we can. I really, really do appreciate it. If you're enjoying this series and if you met me in real life, you'd be like, Daniel, I'd love to buy you a pint or a cup of coffee or something like that. You can do that. I'll put my Ko-fi and Buy Me a Coffee accounts in the description. I'm on there, and you can just send me the price of a cup of coffee or a pint of beer. It's really, really appreciated, and it all goes towards the production of the series and the podcast. You can give me a wee follow on social media as well. I'm on TikTok and Instagram at Mountebank Scotland. I do like funny wee Scottish history videos on there. I put out stand-up clips and stuff like that. And yeah, that's about it, really. And if you're in Edinburgh, if you ever find yourself in the beautiful city of Edinburgh and you want to come do my comedy walking tour or my comedy whiskey tasting, you can find me pretty easily. I've got my website, montebanktours.com. Book on. I always love having people on the tour or at the tastings who have watched the YouTube videos or listened to the podcast. So yeah, feel free to do that if you're in the city. I hope you enjoyed the episode, and I'll see you all next time. Cheerio! Bye-bye!